Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our information session on the Protection of Personal Information Act and how it affects research. My name is Elizabeth de Stadler, and I am the lead consultant on UCT's POPI project. And I'm here today to just help you navigate what is quite an anxiety-provoking experience, I find, when researchers think about POPI, and to give you some reassurance that whatever you think the impact of POPI is going to be or is on research, it's probably not as bad as you think it is. We are going to leave quite a bit of time after the session for questions and answers, so please use the Q&A function if you've got any questions throughout the presentation. I am going to give you quite a lot of information. It's quite a dense presentation, and I'm going to go through it quite fast in order for us to have enough time for questions and discussion, and we will be sharing these slides after the presentation. So here goes. Right. So we're going to do a 5-minute reminder just of some of the fundamental principles of the Protection of Personal Information Act, and then we're going to talk about some specific aspects that impact research the most. So first off, it's really important that we discuss what is considered personal information. It can be anything from identifiers such as your ID number or a research participant number to behavioral information when we track people, when we monitor what they do, what they don't do, what they like, what they dislike, and also demographic information. It's very important also to realize that POPI applies just as much to personal information that is already in the public domain as it does to information that is private, that is not shared with the public at large. I'm going to pause there for a moment and repeat that. So even if information has been made public, it is still subject to POPI. So even those research projects where information is being harvested from public records or from the internet has to contend with this piece of legislation. And then very importantly, some personal information is considered special personal information. So research projects where this kind of information is collected from identifiable research participants, you need to be extra vigilant. And that includes information relating to a person's religious or philosophical beliefs, race or ethnic origin, trade union membership, health information, sex life, biometric information, and then information relating to criminal behavior. So those are considered special personal information, and in a moment when we talk about POPI consent, you will see why this is relevant. But all personal information is deserving of protection, so don't fall into the trap of thinking that just because you don't collect or analyze these types of information that you are getting off scot-free. Unfortunately not. So when we think about the scope of POPI, it's really important that we also think about personal information, or not just personal information, but also what is it to process information. The image that we have there on my right, the blue block, sets out the information life cycle, and around the outside there's the CIA triad, which is the sort of subdivisions of information security management. But POPI prescribes rules at every single stage of the information life cycle. So POPI is not just about security, although it is very important that we protect personal information and we keep it secure. It also dictates rules for when we're planning our research, when we are collecting or creating research data that relates to an identifiable research participant, when we use that information, when we share it, and then ultimately, and often very hypothetically, when we get rid of that information or we decide to archive it or retain it as a record. You would have heard me use the word identifiable quite a lot, and I'm going to get to that. And I also anticipate that there will be a lot of questions around what does it mean for personal information to be identifiable, and we will get to that in a second. All right, so this might seem a little bit familiar, this information lifecycle, and that is because there is something like the research data management lifecycle. This is an image I borrowed from JISC. And you will see that the two correlate quite closely, and it makes it quite easy for us to find a systematic way in order to create order in these principles that are prescribed by the legislation. Right, so there is a code of conduct that is coming. And I mention this because essentially what will happen once there's the code of conduct, which is being drafted by ASSAf, the Association of Science. Once that code gets accredited, which we expect will happen later in the year, it effectively replaces POPI for researchers. Right? So the code sets out in quite a lot of detail all of the different things that research institutions and individual researchers need to be concerned about when we think, does our research comply with POPI? Right. So you will see on the slide there some reasons why a research code is necessary. The one that is most important, I think, for today's purpose is to ensure that we all have a similar or at least a consistent interpretation of what POPI means for research activities. And this is no small task because POPI is not a set of rules. Often people will ask me, can't you just give me a checklist for what I must do? And the answer is almost always no, I cannot. And the reason for that is because this is a piece of legislation that is comprised of a set of principles. And principles are, by their very definition, unlike rules, very context sensitive. So the answer will often be, it depends. But the code then comes in to help us make it a little bit more concrete and to set out all of the factors that we have to consider when we ask and answer the question, is what I'm doing POPI compliant? So what I'm going to do today is to take you through the most important parts of the Code of Conduct. The Code of Conduct is going to circulate later in the month for public comment, and so essentially you are getting a bit of a sneak preview as to what we expect that the code will contain. Right. So these are all of the processes involved in sort of research relating activities that will be affected by POPI and by extension by the Code of Conduct. So first off, it's really important, and we get a lot of contract queries as the POPI team. It's incredibly important that when there's collaboration, when research data is being shared between institutions or with researchers that are not affiliated to UCT, that everything is recorded in contracts. And that is so we can manage the expectations of who is going to do what with the research and how we are going to ensure that it's always protected and respected. There will be some changes to research ethics approval processes. There is a risk assessment that has to be incorporated into that process. And so you can expect, those of you who regularly work with the research ethics approval process, that there will be some adjustments in the types of questions that we ask and the type of assessments that research ethics committees do before they decide to approve a specific research protocol. There is the ever-present question of, do we now need an additional consent? I'm going to talk you through when you need it and how to keep a record of it. It's going to affect, in some instances, the disclosures that we make to research participants. It's going to affect how we collect research data, specifically when we are harvesting it from other sources, and just when we decide where and how to store the information. And this is very important and likely also where researchers will feel the biggest impact. We need to be a lot more careful with where and how we store and preserve research data. We're going to talk a little bit about de-identification or anonymization of research data. And then lastly, the code will have an impact on how we decide whether specific research data is suitable for secondary use. So in other research projects, to the one that the research data was originally collected or created for, and by implication also when we grant or contribute research data to open access platforms. So these are some of the topics that I'm going to address today, but what you should already be able to see is that the implications are quite far-reaching. This is a very large piece of legislation and a lot of ground to cover. So I have picked those topics that are usually the most controversial and are often the subject of the questions that we receive at the POPI team. Right. So we're going to make some key points, and we're going to show you some of the decisions that you have to make when you design your research. Before I start, I want to look at the definition of research, which you should be able to see on your screen right there. And you will see it's a very, very broad definition. It will cover not just academic research or scientific research. It is all research-related activities where we are dealing with the personal information of identifiable research participants. And so the reality is that 9 times out of 10, if a research activity involves human participants, we are going to have to worry a little bit about POPI. Not all research projects will be equally high risk. So when the type of information or the volume of information increases, so does the risk. And so that is why the ASSAf Code is going to prescribe a risk-based approach. There is this saying in data protection circles that the biggest risk of compliance with legislation like POPI is that people do not understand what risks they are exposed to, but the second biggest problem is that they treat all risks as being equally important. It is very, very important that we learn to identify research-related activities that are high risk, and usually they will be high risk because of the volume of information, the type of information, or the type of harm that research participants will suffer if that information is used in an unauthorized way or if there is a data breach. Right. So whilst the scope is very wide, it is important to think about whether a specific research-related activity is high risk or not, and that will determine the amount of effort we put into ensuring that information is safe. Because after all, how long is a piece of string? There are always a very large sort of continuum of safeguards that can be put in place. And the question is how much or how many of these safeguards do we put in place? Right, so I promised we would talk about when information is considered identified or identifiable. Identified is easy. That usually means that the research data is connected to some kind of identifier, anything from a person's name through to their ID number or other identifiable or other identifiers that make them identifiable. Sometimes, however, there isn't an easy or transparent way in which the research participant can be identified. So on the face of it, it looks like anonymous data, but sometimes it's considered identifiable, right? So the code will not apply if all information that identifies a research participant has been permanently deleted or was never collected in the first place. If any information that can be used or manipulated to identify the research participant has been destroyed, or any information that can be linked to other information that identifies the data subject. Now, very often, or the research participant rather, very often I'm asked the question, does that mean that all research data that includes, for instance, samples or genomic information is always identifiable? And the answer to that is no, not always, because we recognize that it is very difficult these days to completely anonymize information. There may always be a way in which someone who has the right information at their disposal can link information together with other information in order to identify a research participant. So the code and other jurisdictions take a very pragmatic approach. They say we must use the motivated intruder test to establish what is the risk of re-identification. So again, that word risk. Sometimes information is completely anonymized, but we realize that often there is a slim possibility that it can be re-identified. So when we determine that risk of re-identification, we will look at, we will kind of use our imaginations and imagine a person that's reasonably competent, has access to appropriate resources like the internet, libraries, public information, and can use investigative techniques. And we will ask ourselves, will such a person be able to re-identify the information? So that, you know, when there is just the slightest risk that someone who is more than just competent, but is a specialist and has a laboratory at their disposal and can do sequencing of DNA, for instance, that is not the test. The test is more general, right? So we look at the risk of re-identification, and very often information will on that basis be considered anonymized, right? So it's very important that we learn to work with this test, and I've provided there some additional resources that you can have a look at. But the most important thing I want you to take from this slide is that even if you can't fully anonymize the information, it is always considered an incredibly strong safeguard to pseudonymize the information. So pseudonymization is where we recognize that we can reverse the anonymization. In other words, we've encrypted, for instance, part of the research data, or not everybody's got access to all of the identifiers. So it's not anonymized, but it is at least pseudonymized. So that not everybody can identify the research participants. And that is a very potent tool. And what the ASSAf Code will say is that whenever reasonably possible, research data must be pseudonymized. So we must mask the identity of the research participants to those people who do not need to know the identity of every single research participant. And if you think about it, when you are working on a project, there are actually very few people who need to be able to identify the research participant fully or by name. So that is always going to be a very strong technique to use to safeguard the information. The next question that we get, apart from, is this information anonymous, is do I need some kind of additional POPI consent in order to do my research? What has happened a lot in the last year since POPI has become effective is that people conflate ethical informed consent with POPI consent, right? So there are the rules of ethics, and if you are doing scientific research, rules that relate, that come from the National Health Act and the NHREC guidelines that determine the instances when you need ethical informed consent from research participants. This stems from their constitutional right not to be experimented on. And that is a separate question to whether you need a data protection or privacy consent. I refer to those consents as POPI consents. And the answer is that actually you very seldom for research need an additional POPI consent. You might need ethical consent, but you don't also need a POPI consent, right? So here the distinction between normal personal information and special personal information becomes very important. When we are dealing with special personal information, so for research purposes, this will often be information relating to a person's political persuasion, relating to their race or ethnicity, relating to their health or their sex life. Those are the most common researched special personal information. You do not need consent if the research is in the public interest, or if it is impossible or would take an unreasonable or disproportionate effort to collect consent. You don't need to get an additional POPI consent. If none of those two factors don't apply, then you do need a POPI consent, right? And it is possible to bundle that with your ethical consent. The requirements for informed consent in terms of POPI and in terms of ethical requirements are very, very similar. Then, if there is no special personal information involved in your research, so none of those special personal information, then you do not need consent if the responsible party, that is usually the university, is obligated to do the research because of law, so contract, legislation, a public law duty, or if it passes something that is called a legitimate interest assessment. A legitimate interest assessment is where we go, how intrusive is this research? What is the possible harm to the data subject? And we weigh that against, is this research in the interest of the research institution, so the university, or the public? And more often than not, the public interest in performing the research outweighs the potential harm to the research participant. And in those instances, you also do not need an additional POPI consent over and above whatever ethical consent you may or may not require. If you're doing research involving children, that is broadly considered in the same way as special personal information again. So there you may need the consent of the child's parent or guardian, right? So whatever you do use, that legal basis, whether it's consent, legitimate interest, or a public law duty, you need to keep a record of what this legal basis is for which you are processing the information. Now, this is an example of an assessment that will be incorporated in the research ethics approval process to determine, does this specific research project require a POPI consent, much like we already evaluate whether informed consent is required for ethical purposes. Right. Now, the other thing that is incredibly important is something called processing limitation, and we see this very often, that researchers over-collect information. So when you do research, and this usually happens when you design your research protocol and you start to decide what information you are going to collect or create, you need to ask yourself, is all of this personal information necessary for this research? What personal information is not necessary for this project, but may be necessary for future research? You can absolutely prepare for potential future research as long as it's not just hypothetical. Why must the personal information be identified for this research? In other words, this is where pseudonymization comes in. If it is not necessary at all to identify research participants, the information should be collected on an anonymous basis. In other words, you don't ever identify the research participants except when you recruited them, and you only collect the information in an anonymous form, or soon after you've collected it, you pseudonymize it to protect it, and only some people can have access to the identifiable data. And then lastly, can the personal can the personal information be pseudonymized? So this is how we meet what is called the processing limitation or the minimality requirements of POPI. Very often people say, oh, but we might not know what we will need in future research. You can do your best to predict that and then justify a broader collection because you know that the research is going to be used in future projects. So POPI allows for that as long as it's not just merely hypothetical or speculative. There needs to be a fairly certain prospect that this data set will be used in future research. You will also in future be asked where you are getting information from. So in most instances, or many instances at least, the information is collected directly from the research participant, and then you can skip merrily past this stage. But if you are harvesting personal information from another source, such as a public record or the internet, then you need to have a justification for that because it is inherently considered quite high risk to do. If it is a public record administrated by a public body, so an example of that would be something like the voters' roll or the deeds registry, then you are entitled to collect information for research purposes. If the research participant made the information public themselves, you are allowed to collect information from another source. And you will see those. That is usually one of the bases on which we justify collecting information from a third party. You can also say that the research participant would not suffer any harm or would have consented to the collection, or that there's no other practical way to collect the information. But when you collect information from another source, a source other than the research participant, you have to be able to justify it. This is very commonly an issue in a research where information is being harvested off social media. There are a couple of concerns relating to social media. First off, that you have to consider whether you are allowed to harvest the information from the platform. Usually there are rules of use against harvesting information of most social media sites. And then comes questions of transparency. So are you notifying people that you are using their information that is on social media? But there's always the question of whether the research participant intended for the information to be used in such a way, and that will often be determined by their privacy settings on their profile and whether they made that information public deliberately. So it is quite complex when you start harvesting information from third-party sources. Right. Then we need to be specific with the purpose of our research. So normally this is recorded exhaustively in research protocols, and this is not a very controversial topic, and normally we already do that, but you need to also specify for how long identifiable personal information will be retained, where it will be retained, who will have access to it, And if it is not going to be retained in an identifiable format, how it is going to be de-identified, and whether there's any risk that a motivated intruder can re-identify it. So we need to make sure that we have that information so we can justify our processing. Right, and now, and we're almost, for those of you who are losing all hope, we're almost at the end of the presentation, so get your questions ready so long. One of the hardest questions that we have to answer is, if information was collected for one purpose, so one research project, for instance, when or under which circumstances can it be reused in other research? Right? And this is in data privacy language known as further processing. It is also sometimes called secondary use. There is a huge, and I'm going to call it a myth that POPI is a threat to open access, for instance, and this is not true. There are very, very broad exemptions in POPI for research because it is recognized that research is often in the public interest, right? So further use of research data is always allowed, even without any further POPI consent from the research participant. And again, POPI consent is a different question to whether you need ethical informed consent, and the debate around broad consent and tiered consent and versus blanket consent, which is not allowable for ethical purposes. But so the question is, do I need an additional further processing consent in terms of POPI? And the question is quite simple. When it comes to information that's going to be used in research-related activities, because of this public interest in making research data available for further research, the question is, will identifiable personal information be used in future research activities? And if the question is yes, we need to make sure that there are measures in place to ensure that the personal information will only be used for research activities, so that, for instance, it can't be used for commercial activities, and that it will not be published in an identifiable form. Right? So very often when we contribute research to open access platforms, that information is already either de-identified or heavily pseudonymized. It's often behind safeguards like a data access committee who will ensure that that information is only used for certain types of research, and that certainly that it's not used, in commercial activities. And there will often be contracts in place that dictate how the research on that platform or the research data can be used, and to ensure that it won't be re-identified. So re-identification as a rule in open access platforms is prohibited. You're not allowed to try and reverse engineer and get to an identifiable research participant. And so these are the types of safeguards that we often see are in place. So POPI is not so much a threat to open access and the sharing of research data as we might think. We just need to learn to become adept at using techniques like pseudonymization to ensure that that information cannot easily be re-identified and won't be published in an identifiable format or used for non-research related activities. Okay, so that is what I wanted to get through today. We also have some slides on information quality. Obviously, there again, the problems are not as acute as when we use personal information for other purposes, because research data quality is incredibly important. Otherwise, your research is flawed. The one thing that we do see quite often is that questions are not properly designed. So when you have questions that are ambiguous or compound, that is a problem. Or answer formats are set to free text, but that is basic sort of research protocol design principles, is that you need to make sure that you are collecting high quality research. And then the last topic that I want to talk about before we go to questions is the issue of security safeguards, right? So, and this is where we get, again, quite a lot of questions that come to the POPI project team. It is important that we safeguard the security of research data. So what does that mean? It means that we have to protect the confidentiality of the agreement. So only authorized people should have access to the personal information. Again, this is not about can I contribute to open access platforms or not, because even in that setting, often there are access controls in place to make sure that it can't be accessed by just anybody. And one of those access controls examples will be, only allowing authenticated users, approved users access. It sits behind what is called a data wall. So that's a username and a password. There might be a data access committee that determines who can get access to the source. So we need to protect the confidentiality of identifiable personal information. We also need to protect its integrity. So this relates to things like master data management. So when you have a pool of research data and you've got multiple people doing things with that research data, how do you keep a track of who has access to it, who has made changes to it, unless it is a central record? In other words, when you start making copies of your research data, there needs to be a little red flag that goes up, because every time you copy it, you lose a little bit of control over how that information is managed. And it should, when at all possible, be managed at a central level, so that if, for instance, the research data changes, it changes for all users of that data set. We also need to protect the availability of the information. So it's just as much about the loss of research data as it is about some hacker getting unauthorized access to it. We have had many anecdotes and stories over the years about enormously valuable intellectual property in the research data being lost because the information is not backed up properly, and this is a true story, it was backed up on external hard drives kept in a suitcase in the corner of a temporary structure that burnt down or got flooded, and I've had several cases like that. So it's really important that we preserve research data, because it usually costs a great deal of money and time and energy to gather it. Then, very important, when you are using technology, that you use university sanctioned technology. Here, what I'm referring to is it should definitely raise a red flag if you are using things like personal Dropbox accounts or personal Google Drives. The intellectual property that is generated by research activities generally is very, very valuable. And so the institutions that own that intellectual property wants it to be protected and used in a safe environment. The problem with personal Dropbox accounts, of course, is that researchers leave the university and stop paying for their Dropbox subscription, and that information gets deleted after a while, for instance. That's just one example of why that is problematic. But also, when we use software, generally speaking, a third party, so someone external to the university, is getting access to that information. What that means is also often that information is now being shared with that third party and shared across borders, so that those third parties often sit in other parts of the world, right? So it becomes very important that we have a view on how trustworthy that third party is, what laws they are subject to, so that the information is as protected as it would be had it been stored in South Africa, right? And that is also often a question of contract. So when you use software service providers, particularly when it is for storage solutions, you need to make sure that the university has reviewed the contract with that third party. And so that's why we say rather be safe and use university sanctioned software or hardware for that matter. The most potent information security tool at our disposal, I would say, is to pseudonymize the information. Even better yet, if you don't need identifiable research participants to begin with, just don't collect the information in an identifiable form. But pseudonymization is going to be a very potent tool along with encryption, and those two often go hand in hand as the most sort of fundamental safeguards that we can put that we can use to protect research data once we've moved past all of the infrastructure questions. So pseudonymization, I would encourage all of you to go read up about it. There are various guides to pseudonymizing information, or pseudonymizing, I never know what the right word is. I would encourage everybody to become au fait with that concept and ask yourself very critically whether it isn't possible for you to do that with your research data. Right, I think it's time for some questions. We usually get quite a lot, so I'm going to start going through them. I also just want to, at this point, reassure you that if we don't get through all of the questions, that we will definitely also post a frequently asked question document after the session. Okay, right, so I'm going to start just from the very top and let's see how many of them we can get through. This question is, I'm in a role that approves the delivery of data from a provincial medical data repository. What is my duty to ensure that the researchers applying, and now I've lost the question, to ensure that the researchers applying for the data downloads for further processing behave themselves with regards to POPI, such as only disseminating non-identified data. Okay, so the best way to do that is if those researchers are not, I apologize, guys, I'm just trying to tame my, okay, the chat function here keeps jumbling up the question. So,
published?
No, that's fine, I've got it. Thanks, Veronica. So the best way to control that is to ensure that the researchers themselves or the institutions to which they belong have signed a form of rules of use, right? So you can't really control them except to bind them to certain policies and rules of use. And one of those rules would be that they are not allowed to re-identify the information, or they shouldn't even attempt to re-identify the information. Other more stringent measures that you could put in place is a data access committee that evaluates sort of applications for access, that gives you greater control over whether their research protocols are designed in a POPI compliant way, but that might not be feasible for you, in which case a contractual obligation to comply with the legislation is sort of your next port of call. Okay. Does personal information apply only to natural persons or also to companies and other institutions? That's a very good question. So POPI is a very strange beast in this regard. There are only, well, last time I counted, 2 other countries that also protects the personal information of organizations. Now, organizations' personal information is often also in public records like SIP-C. So the sort of level of protection, I would say, is not exactly the same, but in principle, information relating to organizations, that is anything from a company through to a university, is also considered personal information and is also protected by the Act. Very often, personal information of organizations in any event contain personal information of individual directors, shareholders, employees, etc. So often that distinction is more theoretical, I would say. But yes, POPI in principle does protect also not just individuals, but also organizations. Does the Act apply retrospectively for work that has already received research ethics approval? That is a very good question. Yes. So any processing that has been conducted since the 1st of July last year is subject to the legislation. So the Act, and I mean, that's a bit of an oversimplification. The Act does not require time travel. So you do not need to, you know, for instance, you've already collected the information, and so the rules relating to collecting the information itself doesn't really apply. But you are subject to the code and to POPI if you are currently processing personal information, even though that information was collected in the past. So typically what we are concerned about in that regard is if you have a legal basis. So in other words, for special personal information, there are one set of legal justifications, and for normal personal information, the others. Did you need a POPI consent, for instance? And I'll navigate back to that slide, although I'm not seeing all of my slides at the moment. So that's one question. But the most important one is, are you keeping that information secure? So this slide that we're on is the one that typically affects existing or current research projects the most. Right. So I think that it is quite important particularly if you're using very sensitive personal information or large volumes of personal information, that you do ask yourself some critical questions around information security. But yes, the Act applies on processing that took place post 1 July 2021. Will this new information delay ethical clearance processes for projects? Okay, so as with the previous question, these questions are actually a little bit more for the institution, I would say. So let me just explain what the university will be doing in the coming months. So I've now referred to the code quite a lot. It's coming out, as I said, for public comment in a couple of weeks. And then there is still quite a long approval process. But obviously, in the meantime, the university has to be POPIA compliant. So it was, I think, it's the beginning of last year or the year before even, perhaps. I've lost my sense of time due to COVID. And the university has started a POPIA project. And part of the focus of that project for this year will be implementing the ASSAf code, or implementing, for instance, the changes to the research ethics approval process. My experience at other institutions has been that it does not delay ethical clearance processes. In fact, it is a good opportunity to see if they can't be streamlined even more. So a lot of institutions are using this as a excuse to do a little bit of housekeeping, if I can put it like that. But the reason why I can say with so much confidence that it doesn't delay the research ethics clearance process is because the types of questions that we have to ask in order to gauge POPIA compliance are very, very similar to the questions that we have to ask in order to determine whether a specific research protocol is ethical. There's about, in our experience, 85% correlation between those two questions. In other words, if there are ethical concerns, there are likely POPIA concerns. And if there are not ethical concerns, it's fairly unlikely that there are POPIA concerns. The important exception to that is that we do expect that we're going to have to be more careful with the security safeguards that we record in our research data management plans. And so there's just a little bit of extra thinking work that researchers have to do as they design their research protocols to ensure that the information will be secure. But we will do everything in our power to ensure that this does not delay ethics approval. All right, we've got a question regarding survey data. If we have some data on the individual, for instance, sex, age, region, income bracket, which in theory can let us narrow down to a few dozen people, is this considered anonymized? Okay, so anonymization is often a question of degree. And degree of what? Well, the level or degree of risk of re-identification. So when you think about whether something is identified or identifiable rather, think about what are the steps a person would have to take and what is the other information that a person would need access to in order to link this personal information with other personal information and make it identifiable. So we look at things like, is the information that they would need to make this information identifiable publicly available? If the answer is no, it is not, then the risk of re-identification becomes quite low. And in fact, it becomes sometimes so low that we consider the information de-identified. In other words, the prospect of it being re-identified is so remote or so slim that we can consider it anonymized. But these days, very few data sets are 100% certain that it is anonymized because of the advances in technology and computing. So it's a question of degree. What is the risk of re-identification by a reasonably motivated intruder? So I see Ronica posted a useful link, guidance to staff and students for researchers. For research, there are so many good resources out there. As I said, Ronica will also post in the comments here access to the existing resources that UCT has, and a lot of these questions are already answered in the various FAQs that are available there. But a lot about this has been cleared up in the past. POPIA is very, very similar to European legislation on data protection. So generally speaking, We find the research guides that have been published by universities in the United Kingdom or in the European Union very, very useful, and POPI is similar enough that we can learn a great deal from them. Do you recommend that ethics committees who approve research be appraised of the requirements of POPI, and can they do the legitimate interest assessment? That is a tricky question. I'm going to preface my answer by saying that I realize that research ethics committees are already burdened with quite a lot, or saddled with quite a lot of responsibility. And for the people who are on those ethics committees, of course, this is not their only job. So we are very mindful of placing too much of a burden on RECs. So what we are going to do, and what the ASSAf Code very strongly recommends, is that universities employ a risk-based approach where there is a risk assessment comprised of about 10 questions, all relating to the type of information that is collected, whether the volume of the information that's collected, whether the information will, for instance, be shared or published in an identifiable form, and that determines whether we are dealing with a high-risk research activity. When that is the case, yes, I do think that research ethics committees should be trained to tick a couple of POPI boxes, and we may require more consultation with, for instance, information security specialists, but those projects will be the exception rather than the rule. I would hazard a guess, based on just experience with those kinds of assessments, that somewhere between 80 and 90% of the research that is conducted at the university is fairly low risk, in which case the researchers can take responsibility to ensure that they meet the guidelines and the rules set out in the code without too much interference from a research ethics committee. But in high-risk cases, the university may in future decide to place that obligation on RECs with support from other parts of the university. But that is still an open question, and we will answer that during the course of this year as we implement the code, if that, to see whether that is the best route to follow. Our employer and its contracted entities constantly make us identify our so-called race as per racist apartheid legislature. Will this ever end? Even considering POPI alone, all this racial and racist documentation stored about us is illegal. Okay, so it's an important question, and I'm going to break it down just a little bit. So I want to take out of the question about, general questions about whether we should still have, BEE requirements, and whether the Employment Equity Act is constitutional or not, is a very, very important question. So we've got current South African legislation that requires your employer to know your race, the Employment Equity Act. That piece of legislation has not been challenged on constitutional grounds recently. So as things stand, because there is legislation that requires the collection of information relating to race, it is not illegal for the university to collect that information. POPI itself says that where there are pieces of national legislation that requires the collection of special personal information, that the responsible party, in this case the employer, must collect that information per that national legislation. It is, of course, open to anybody to challenge the constitutionality of the Employment Equity Act with the Constitutional Court. But as things stand, as of today, it is legal in terms of POPI for employers to collect information about the race of their employees. What if key informants have given consent to use their names in published work? Okay, so as long as that consent is, and there are a couple of requirements, but they're very similar to ethical consent. As long as that consent is informed, it is specific, and it's voluntary, and it is an expression of will. In other words, they had to tick a box or sign their name or say yes. It couldn't have been an opt-out. Then, even in terms of POPI, if they consented into further publication of identifiable data, you are entitled to do so. But you have to be very, very sure that that consent was informed, that it was specific, that it was voluntary, and that it was an expression of will, not an assumption on your part. Okay. a lot of this sounds like it relates to survey data. How do we deal with in-depth qualitative data collection? So in interviews or ethnography, it's really difficult to make the data fully anonymous because of the detail needed. Is there consent that their identity that their personal information might be identifiable adequate? Yes, again, so the consent requirements in terms of POPIA are very strict, just like with informed consent for ethical purposes. So you could go that route to say you consent to your identifiable information being used in this research, and along with that, you know, all of the information that they need to make an informed decision. In some instances, that POPIA consent might not even be required, because, as I said, there are other bases that you can use. So, for instance, when we're just talking about normal personal information, there isn't any special personal information involved. You could say that it is in the legitimate interest of the university and the country as a whole that this research is done in an identifiable format. If there is special personal information, so based on your question, it sounds like at least race and ethnicity will be included. If that research is in the public interest, as most research is, and you are not going to publish the research in an identifiable form. In other words, the research data in its raw form might be identifiable, but you're not going to publish that research data in an identifiable form. You don't even need consent. But again, the question of consent is twofold. Firstly, do I need ethical consent? And then do I need an additional POPIA consent? Those are two very separate questions. And so even though I say you might not need an additional POPIA consent, it does not mean that you necessarily that you don't need an informed ethical consent. Okay, a practical question. Where can I store my data? I don't know what an HDD is. In the cloud, any cloud, must it be encrypted? Must the key pseudonyms to enable the re-identification be explicitly kept under different conditions? Will UCT provide a service for secure storage? So the answer to that question, and I know that Andre Leroux is also on the call, so Andre, just be on standby here. So the university is working on answering these questions easier by having these pre-approved storage solutions. There's unfortunately no sort of definitive answer to all of these questions. I'm going to answer the pseudonymization one, and then Andre, maybe you can talk about storage in the cloud and what is approved UCT storage. But generally, what will give the game away that a certain piece of software or a cloud service provider is approved by the university is whether you are using a university account. That's always a good test. If you're using a personal account, red flag should be raised. But if you are using a university account with the cloud service provider, generally speaking, that would mean that the university has sanctioned the use of that specific platform, or same goes for software. When it comes to pseudonymization, yes, the information that can be used to re-identify the information needs to be stored separately. Otherwise, you've got a single point of failure. So if someone gets unauthorized access, they have access to both the tools to re-identify as well as the personal information. So that information needs to be stored separately. Sometimes we even make use of zero trust encryption, where only a third party can re-identify the information for us. But all of this is a matter of degree. With security, there are always things that we can do to make it more secure. And so we have to ask the question, what is the risk to the research participant if this information is compromised, and what is the risk to the university if this information is lost? And that is why it's so important that we distinguish high-risk research, which normally has to do with volume of research data, from other projects where this might not be as important. Andre, do you want to add anything?
Elizabeth, I think you've covered it rather extensively. I just would like to mention there is one UCT provided storage solution, or indirectly in fact, and that is the Google Drive. That one is not necessarily recommended for the storage of personal information due to the contract and where the data is stored. But the rest, I think you've covered quite well. Thank you.
So there is a very useful post as well for university-sanctioned research data systems and services. There is a link posted in the Q&A. So Brandon, you can also have a look at that. Then we've answered this one. Is a book still considered research if the author intends to write for general audience and make money out of it? Can anonymized research data be used for this purpose? Yes. So there is a general exemption from POPI for literary and journalistic purposes. And when we talk about even research that is what we would refer to as a literature study, where there's no human research participants, just perhaps statistical or aggregated data, then POPI won't apply. So there's two things. There's an exemption for literary works, which would include most books, I would say. And then there is also the question of whether any identifiable personal information is used at all. And if the answer is no, it's only statistics or aggregated personal information, then, POPI does not apply. See a lot of questions around the university sanctioned software and services, and there's a very useful link there under the library for that. In considering the motivated intruder test, where do hackers fit in? Right, so again, it's a matter of degree. If it would take a very high or specialized level of knowledge in order to hack the database where identifiable personal information is stored, then the risk of the security compromise becomes quite low. So some hackers are very low, are not necessarily that specialized, and if they could easily get access to the information, then the safeguards would be considered quite weak. But if it would require a very, very highly skilled hacker to get access to this information, in all probability, we would say that you have put reasonable safeguards in place, because there's no such thing as information that is absolutely safe. There's this very famous quote in our circles that says there are only two types of organizations in the world: the ones who know that they've been hacked and the ones that don't know that they've been hacked. So it is absolute safety is impossible. So we think in degrees. So again, with anonymization, the motivated, if we think about a motivated intruder, we're thinking about a reasonably capable person, not a highly specialized person that could, like in the movies, hack the CIA mainframe. That is an unreasonably high standard to uphold. Okay, if data is collected ethnographically in a small town or neighborhood, does the neighborhood or town need to be anonymized? So sometimes location data can give away who the research participants are. And again, it's going to be a matter of degree. It depends on the size of that geographical area and how many people live there and what other information you are collecting. There's this famous study in Stanford, I think, one of the Ivy League universities, where they found that if you've got the zip code, the gender, and the birth date of an American, roughly 80% of them are fully identifiable. But that has to do with the combination of the information. So yes, while location data in combination with other data sets might make people identifiable, if you are only collecting town and not birth date, it might become a lot easier. So again, question of degree. And I realize that this might be infuriating, but that is how it is with principle-based legislation. And why? And I'm going to close off with this thought. Why is it that we needed principle-based legislation? Why couldn't they just make rules that are easy to apply? The reason for that is because often personal information is used in activities that are enormously valuable and very necessary and in the public interest. And research is exactly that type of activity. So if we had rules-based legislation, it would in all likelihood have stopped research that would have been enormously valuable to the South African society. And so that is why POPI feels a lot like an ethical inquiry. And that is good news. So I want to tell everybody, specifically those of you who are old hands, you know, who are career researchers, if you are doing something with personal information and it's making you feel uneasy, it's triggering that alarm bell, listen to it and get some advice. We are here to provide you with that advice, or at least to guide you along how you should be thinking about these issues. But there is a very close correlation between whether something is acceptable by an ethical standard and whether something is acceptable using the POPI principles. Very, very often those two correlate. So I don't want you to be too concerned. If your research is ethical, it is fairly likely that it is also POPI compliant. Just make sure that you keep that information as secure as possible. And if you have any concerns or any questions about your specific research, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And with that, it is 11 o'clock and I'm going to call the session to a close. Thank you very much for everybody who participated. And we will make all of this information available to you.